Autumn cold seeped into the mountain landscape, spreading through the trees like thick fingers of mist. It drifted low to the ground and wrapped everything in a soft, muffled veil. Daniel arrived late in the afternoon, exhausted from long weeks of work and longing for silence. He wanted to spend a few days in a secluded cabin to rest and finally breathe again. When he reached the wooden structure standing at the edge of the forest, it appeared abandoned, almost forgotten by time. The door was slightly open, which surprised him since the cabin's owner assured him everything was left locked. He assumed the wind was to blame and didn't dwell on it. Inside, he was greeted by a silence so deep it reminded him of an underground cave, where even air seems to pause. He settled in, started a fire, and felt tension slowly leave his shoulders, unaware that peace was the last thing that would come. Night fell quickly, carrying with it an unusual heaviness. Daniel sat in an old wooden chair, listening to the gentle crackling of the fire. After a while, he walked to the window and glanced outside. All he saw was fog, thick, rolling, and impenetrable. When he moved to draw the curtains, he noticed faint, wet footprints on the wooden floor. They led from the entrance toward the corner of the room, and then abruptly stopped. He was certain he hadn't seen them when he arrived. He convinced himself they were just melted snow or drops carried in by the cold air. He eventually went to sleep, but deep into the night he woke with the unsettling feeling of being watched. He sat up slowly. The silence in the room felt heavier than before, as though even the crackling fire dared not interrupt it. Its glow dimmed, causing shadows to stretch unnaturally across the walls. For a moment, Daniel could have sworn that something was moving within those shadows. Morning arrived reluctantly, offering no sense of comfort. When Daniel stepped outside, he saw fresh snow surrounding the cabin, completely untouched. No footprints, no signs of life. Nothing to explain the wet marks from the night before. When he returned inside, something new caught his attention. In the middle of the floor lay several small pieces of wood, arranged with deliberate accuracy. They formed a shape far too precise to be accidental. Someone or something had placed them there. Disturbed, Daniel scattered them across the room, trying to shake the growing unease. He spent the day attempting to distract himself, but a silent pressure kept building in the back of his mind. The second night was far worse than the first. Outside, slow measured footsteps began circling the cabin. Daniel strained to convince himself it was an animal, but the steps were heavy and steady, moving from window to window. Each time they approached, the air inside the cabin seemed to thicken. He resisted the urge to look outside, but eventually curiosity overcame him. He pulled back the curtain just enough to see. A tall, dark figure stood motionless outside. There were no features, no edges to the silhouette, just a shape carved from the deepest part of the night. Daniel froze. The figure didn't move, yet every part of him felt its attention. The long hours dragged on. The figure vanished and reappeared. Shadows in the room stretched and contorted. The dark corner of the cabin began to feel wrong, almost alive. Whenever Daniel looked toward it, he sensed a presence standing there, even though his eyes never caught its true form. When he checked the old clock on the wall, he realized time had stopped. The hands were frozen at 3:13. The moment seemed disconnected from reality, as if the cabin had slipped into a suspended world between night and something else entirely. Darkness grew heavier. Cold seeped through the walls. Daniel understood he was trapped in a moment that refused to move forward. When daylight finally returned, Daniel doubted it was real. He rushed to leave, but the car refused to start. The battery was completely drained. Inside the cabin, an invisible presence weighed on every breath he took. The image of the dark figure outside the window remained carved into his mind. But what haunted him more was the shadow he felt in the corner behind him. Once more, he saw the wooden pieces on the floor. They were arranged again, this time with frightening precision. Every small fragment lined up perfectly, forming a pattern that could not be accidental. Daniel realized the coming night would be the turning point. After sunset, the cabin fell into a thick, consuming darkness. The fire in the hearth barely glowed. Outside, the footsteps returned, faster this time. They encircled the cabin restlessly. Scratching noises brushed lightly along the windows, as if invisible hands were searching for a way inside. Inside, the darkest corner of the room thickened until it appeared almost solid. Daniel stared at it, and the sensation of a silent, waiting presence grew stronger than ever. The night stretched endlessly. Time stopped once again. Daniel tried to remain awake, but fatigue overtook him. His memory blurred. He no longer knew what his last waking moment was. Whether it was the sight of the figure at the window or the feeling of something standing only a few steps away in the corner. The moment consciousness left Daniel, the cabin fell into a silence even deeper than before. It was not the ordinary quiet found in nature. It was something more oppressive, as though the world outside had been momentarily removed. The air no longer carried the natural rhythm of life. There was no rustle of branches, no distant howl of wind, no shifting of mist. Everything was frozen in a suspended, breathless stillness. The fire in the hearth died out completely, leaving behind only the faint, cold glow of embers. Shadows stretched across the floor, merging with the thick darkness that had gathered in the far corner of the room. This darkness behaved differently now. Its shape was no longer formless. It had weight, depth, intention. It seemed to pulse faintly, expanding and contracting like a slow, silent breath. Outside, the footsteps that had circled the cabin continued a while longer, but even they eventually faded. And yet, the impression of movement never truly left. The boards of the porch creaked ever so slightly, as if reacting to a weight that was not entirely physical. Hours passed without any sign of dawn. Time felt displaced. The moonless sky stayed fixed in place, casting the cabin into an endless night. When Daniel finally began to stir, the darkness in the corner seemed to retract slightly, as though retreating into itself, watching, waiting for him to open his eyes. When Daniel awoke, his body felt heavy, like it had been submerged in cold water. A faint numbness clung to his muscles. His thoughts formed slowly, as though rising from a deep depth. At first, he assumed the night had finally passed, but when he looked toward the window, he found only darkness. Not dawn, not even the faintest hint of gray. The clock on the wall remained frozen at 3:13. He sat up with effort, his breath visible in the frigid air. The temperature had dropped dramatically. Frost coated the inside of the windows like delicate white feathers. Even the wooden beams above him seemed to tremble softly, as if overwhelmed by the cold. Moving through the cabin, he noticed subtle changes, small shifts that suggested a presence had continued roaming during his sleep. A chair had moved. A blanket was no longer on the bed but folded neatly beside it. On the table, dust gathered in unnatural patterns, as though brushed by something that had no physical form. The pieces of wood he had scattered earlier were now arranged once again, this time more intricately, forming a set of concentric shapes that spiraled inward. Each piece aligned perfectly with the next, as though placed by an artist with infinite patience. Daniel felt an instinctive pressure deep within him, a silent warning he couldn't interpret, but which he could not ignore. Something was drawing closer, not physically, but through layers of perception, through the fragile boundary between what is seen and what is merely sensed. The day, or what he assumed was day, dragged on without a single change in the darkness outside. Hours became impossible to measure. The cabin's interior seemed to shift subtly, as though the structure itself was slowly leaning inward. Floorboards creaked under their own weight, causing faint vibrations that hummed through the walls. The air thickened to the point that each breath felt heavier than the last. Daniel attempted to light another fire, but the flames refused to catch. The logs remained cold, almost damp to the touch. Even the smallest spark extinguished instantly, as though swallowed by something unseen. He tried to force himself to stay awake, but exhaustion seeped through every part of him, sapping his strength. In the far corner, the darkness slowly regathered. It seemed denser now, almost textured. It rippled faintly like fabric moving in an unfelt breeze. Whenever Daniel looked away, it felt as though it crept slightly closer, only to freeze the moment he returned his gaze. He wandered through the cabin, searching for something, anything that felt real, a sense of time, light, warmth, but nothing responded. The world outside remained pitch black, and the forest was silent as stone. As his thoughts began to unravel, Daniel felt memories slipping through his fingers. He recalled arriving at the cabin, but the image was faint. The face of the cabin's owner blurred. The reason he had come here became uncertain. Everything beyond the walls felt distorted, as though the world outside had already been consumed. The moment he closed his eyes for even a second, a sudden shift occurred, subtle yet unmistakable. The boards beneath him groaned. A presence brushed past him, cold and weightless, leaving behind a sharp chill in the air. The corner was no longer empty. The figure that stood within the corner was not something his eyes could fully define. It was not a shadow, yet it was darker than any shadow could be. It stood tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that suggested length without revealing details. The air around it vibrated faintly, as if reacting to a force that did not belong in the physical world. Daniel felt a heaviness in his chest, a suffocating dread that made movement difficult. His body seemed torn between paralysis and the instinct to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Outside the windows was nothing but endless darkness. Inside the cabin, the figure occupied the only exit. It shifted ever so slightly, not a movement, but a change of presence. The darkness felt as though it leaned forward, observing him, not with eyes, but with something else, something older, deeper, more primal than sight. The presence intensified with each breath Daniel took. His surroundings blurred. The walls of the cabin wavered as though submerged underwater. The floor felt frozen beneath his feet. The air filled with a faint hum, resonating low and steady, like a sound that was not meant to be heard by human ears. Then something happened that made the air itself tremble. The figure expanded, not physically, but perceptually, as though it unfolded its essence, revealing layers of itself that were previously hidden. The shadows stretched outward, crawling across the floorboards, reaching the fireplace, the bed, the windows. They crept closer to Daniel's feet like tendrils that wished to anchor themselves to him. The clock on the wall began to vibrate. Its hands twitched violently, though they never changed from 3:13. Frost deepened across the windows, forming intricate spiraling shapes that mirrored the wooden pattern on the floor. Daniel felt himself being pulled, slowly, gently toward the corner. He resisted. He fought against the sensation, forcing his legs to remain still. But the pull continued, not physically, but from the depths of his mind. His thoughts began to fragment, unraveling like loose threads tugged by invisible fingers. Then the world shifted again. The cabin seemed to tilt, subtly at first, then violently. Daniel collapsed to the floor, clutching at the boards as the darkness folded inward and outward, spiraling into impossible shapes. And then, silence, total and absolute. When Daniel regained consciousness, he lay on the floor, his body aching and stiff. The cabin was nearly unrecognizable. The furniture was rearranged in unfamiliar ways. The walls felt closer, as though the room had shrunk during the night. The floorboards had shifted, forming uneven ridges beneath him. The darkness outside remained unchanged. No hint of dawn, no moon, no stars. Just an oppressive void pressing against the windows, like a living thing. He rose slowly, each movement hesitant. His breath hung in the air like smoke, lingering unnaturally long. The temperature continued to drop. Frost crept across every surface, walls, table, even his clothes. He tried once more to force open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt fused to the frame, as though sealed by the cold or something far more sinister. Even the windows resisted his attempts to open them. As he turned back to the room, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the far wall, a new pattern had formed. Frost traced delicate looping shapes, spirals, lines, and arcs that intertwined with uncanny precision. It resembled a map, but not of any place he recognized. It felt like a diagram of moments, not locations, a representation of time folding inward. At the center of the pattern, a faint outline suggested a doorway, not a physical one, but something conceptual, a passage etched into the very fabric of the cabin. The shadows in the room responded to it. They gathered near the frost pattern, drawn as though compelled by an unseen force. The presence in the corner returned, faint but undeniable. The figure's essence seeped through the walls, converging with the spiraled frost. Daniel realized something horrifying. The cabin was no longer just a place. It was becoming something else, a threshold. 13. The threshold of the unseen. As hours passed, if they were indeed hours, Daniel felt the boundary between reality and something beyond beginning to thin. The walls of the cabin trembled with a rhythmic pulse, similar to a heartbeat but slower, deeper. Each pulse caused the frost patterns to glow faintly, illuminating the room with a pale, ghostly light. The air vibrated with energy that made his skin tingle and his eyes water. Shadows thickened at the edges of the room, their forms merging and shifting like figures in a distant crowd, too far to distinguish but too close to ignore. Daniel approached the frost-covered wall, compelled by a force he couldn't resist. As he drew closer, he felt a warmth radiating from the center of the pattern, an odd contrast to the surrounding cold. The warmth pulsed, harmonizing with the rhythmic trembling of the cabin. His fingertips brushed the icy surface. The frost expanded instantly, racing across his skin like lightning. His vision blurred. The cabin shook violently. The frost pattern began to move, shifting, swirling, reconfiguring itself into shapes that defied logic. At that moment, Daniel understood something with absolute clarity. The figure had not been trying to enter the cabin. It had been trying to bring the cabin into its own space. The threshold was opening, and he was standing at its center. The temperature dropped so drastically, he felt his lungs tighten. The air filled with a resonance so deep, it felt like his bones vibrated. The room darkened again, but this time it was not because of absence of light. It was because of the presence of something else. The shadows merged. A shape formed. The same towering silhouette he had glimpsed outside and felt in the corner. Now fully defined, fully present. It approached silently, its form flickering between solid and ethereal. As it reached the frost-covered wall, the entire cabin seemed to sigh, an exhale of ancient air that had been trapped for far too long. The threshold opened. Darkness poured through like water through a shattered barrier, consuming everything in its path. Daniel's vision dissolved, his world folded inward, and the cabin disappeared. Days later, though no one could confirm how many, forestry workers made their way up the mountain. They approached the clearing where the cabin had stood for decades, but found only an empty patch of ground. The foundation stones remained, but the structure itself had vanished without a trace. No rubble, no burned wood, nothing. The snow in the clearing formed strange, spiraling patterns, perfectly symmetrical, too precise to be natural. The workers felt uneasy. The forest around them was silent in a way they had never experienced. No birds, no wind, no movement. It was as if the entire area was holding its breath. One of the men spotted something half buried in the snow, a small wooden fragment, carved with faint, looping lines. He picked it up but dropped it immediately. The wood was ice cold, colder than anything natural. The group decided to leave quickly, uneasy and unsettled. As they walked back into the forest, a faint sound followed them. Soft, slow footsteps matching their pace, though none of them turned to look. Deep in the silent clearing, the snow began to shift. The spirals expanded subtly, rearranging themselves. And at the center of the pattern, for just a moment, a tall, dark silhouette appeared, before melting back into the trees.